December 17, 1944, Hansfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank coughed once, hiccuped, then died. In the frozen stillness, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the hatch, the metallic echo fading into the fog. His driver tried again, grinding the starter. Nothing. The fuel gauge stared back accusingly, empty. Peiper climbed down, boots crunching in frost. Around him stretched the pride of the 6th SS Panzer Army, 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and 5,000 of Hitler's elite Waffen-SS, motionless hulks in a winter dawn. The spearhead of Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Grand Ardennes Offensive, had run out of gas. Literally. Through drifting mist, the abandoned American position of Hansfeld lay ahead. Oil drums still smoked, coffee still steamed, and lined like sacrificial offerings stood rows of olive-drab jerrycans. Thousands. Fuel by the acre. Peiper's adjutant pried one open, sniffed, and grinned. High-octane gasoline. Engines roared to life as men scrambled to feed German armor with American fire. Peiper paced among the cans, counting aloud. 50,000 gallons, enough to push his group to the Meuse River and perhaps change the war. But another thought gnawed at him. If Americans could abandon what Germany guarded with entire divisions, then victory was fantasy. The war was already lost. It simply hadn't been admitted. 6 months earlier, Armaments Minister Albert Speer had handed Hitler a report that should have ended every offensive. Allied bombing had annihilated Germany's synthetic fuel works. Plants that once produced 175,000 tons in April 1944 yielded barely 5,000 by September. The Ruhr's hydrogenation centers ran below 10% capacity. Meanwhile, the numbers across the Atlantic bordered on absurd. U.S. crude oil output, 1944, 1.8 billion barrels. Germany plus Romania plus synthetic output, 33 million barrels. 2%. That was the mathematical distance between modern war and medieval exhaustion. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht fought a mechanized campaign powered by horses. Nazi fuel convoys crawled through ruin while American trucks surfed oceans of petroleum. Major Friedrich Zimmermann calculated that the Ardennes attack would need 4.5 million gallons just to reach Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million, of which barely half arrived. The plan required capturing Allied fuel to keep moving, a confession of bankruptcy disguised as strategy. Across the Channel, the U.S. Army kept plumbing miracles. Pipeline under the ocean, Pluto, sent gasoline beneath waves from Britain to France. The Red Ball Express, 6,000 trucks a day, rushed 12,500 tons of supplies overland. By December, Allied armies in Northwest Europe consumed 1.2 million gallons daily, yet still received 1.4 million. They were building surplus while fighting. At 29, Peiper was already legend. The youngest regimental commander in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, survivor of Kursk and Kharkov. He understood that modern war ran on fuel as surely as blood. His battle group was the hammer point of Hitler's final gamble, expected to pierce Allied lines, seize crossings, and open the road to Antwerp. On December 14th, Peiper attended the last briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich spoke plainly. You will have fuel to reach the Meuse only if you capture American supplies. The figures were grotesque. A 31,000 gallon reserve, good for 50 miles. Antwerp lay 65 miles away. Failure was literally built into the arithmetic. Peiper ordered single-file travel to save petrol and forbade idling longer than 5 minutes. Capturing fuel ranked above every tactical objective. At the same moment, a mere 20 miles away, U.S. Captain James Rose logged in his diary. Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage full. The contrast could have powered a thesis on civilization itself. At 0530 on December 16th, German guns erupted across 85 miles of front, hurling more shells in 2 hours than some battles had seen in months. Yet the spectacle masked reality. Behind the fury, empty tanks lurked. Peiper's column rolled at 0700. The roads marked as highways on German maps proved forest tracks, narrow and snow-clogged. Traffic jams stacked miles deep as armored beasts idled, gulping the liquid they couldn't spare. At Lanzerath, 18 U.S. reconnaissance men blocked the advance for 10 hours, an entire day's worth of consumption wasted in a standoff that should have lasted minutes. By dawn December 17th, Peiper had traveled just 20 miles yet spent 40% of his fuel. He was already past the rational limits of success. Then came Hansfeld and the mountains of American gasoline that glowed like treasure in the mist. Peiper's men stacked jerry cans 3 meters high over 200 yards. High-octane aviation fuel mixed with 80-plus motor grade, a cocktail too rich for temperamental Maybachs. Some engines coughed in protest at their own good fortune. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman rifled the depot office and found shipping manifests stamped Texas, New York, Liverpool, Normandy, Hansfeld. He traced 6,000 miles of transit accomplished in under 6 weeks. I showed the papers to Peiper, Hoffman recalled decades later. He read them twice, crumpled them, and said nothing, but his face turned white. We both knew what they meant. Another soldier leafed through Stars and Stripes, the American Army newspaper, dated 2 days earlier, celebrating a new pipeline capable of pumping 300,000 gallons per day. A single steel vein that moved more fuel daily than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe would use in the whole offensive. Since May 1944, Allied bombers had shattered the Reich's fuel system. Flight training collapsed from 250 hours to 60. Battleships rusted at anchor. U-boats limped on snorkels to save diesel. Civilians filled carts with hay while air raid ruins sprouted vegetable gardens. The same world that worshipped horsepower now harnessed horses again. 1 can of gasoline could trade for a month's wages. Farmers plowed with oxen. Doctors bicycled to surgeries. Meanwhile, the United States produced 2/3 of the planet's oil. The East Texas field alone outpumped German-occupied Europe. Standard Oil ran such glutted refineries that engineers experimented with synthetic rubber simply to consume excess crude. For Germans, fuel was sacred. For Americans, it was background noise. With their unexpected windfall, Peiper's column lunged forward, seizing Beilingen by noon and netting more cans, rations, even fresh maps. The documents showed another truth more demoralizing than defeat. Not one single American depot, but hundreds. Fuel depots dotted every crossroads like pearls on a chain. The U.S. First Army alone sat on reserves exceeding 3.5 million gallons. Peiper pressed toward La Gleize and eventually Stavelot, unaware that ahead lay the inferno destined for his realization. There, engineers of the 291st Combat Battalion would torch 2.1 million gallons rather than let him touch a drop. The column reached the outskirts of Stavelot on the afternoon of December 17th. Through gusts of snow, they saw the air vibrating with heat. A wall of orange flame roared into the sky. American engineers were turning the horizon into sunrise. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received a 3-word order: deny the fuel. His depot contained more than 2 million gallons stored in acres of olive cans and drums. At 16:30, he ordered his crews to scatter gasoline among the stacks and ignite white phosphorus grenades. The blast rolled like thunder over the valleys. Within minutes, 15 acres of fire spun upward, the black column visible for 50 miles. When Peiper's forward tanks arrived, they faced a monster built of their own salvation. Flames leapt 100 feet high, devouring the only supply that could have saved them. Crews watched the inferno in stunned silence. Unterführer Weber, the driver of Peiper's command Tiger, remembered it for the rest of his life. The Herr Sturmbannführer stood on the turret until the heat pushed him back. They can burn it, he said quietly, because they have oceans. Across the Ardennes that same day, American engineers repeated the ritual. Troupons gone 1.1 million gallons up in smoke. Spa another 2.5 million. In a single week, they deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons, more than the entire German allocation for the offensive. Every Allied fire told the same story. America's power didn't rest in courage or strategy, but in depth. Destroying millions of gallons hurt them less than losing a dozen soldiers. The Germans finally saw that they were fighting a nation for which fuel was as common as snow. The Red Ball Express was that abundance in motion, 6,000 trucks painted with bright red discs that thundered down French highways day and night. They carried 412,000 tons of supplies in a month, burning so much gasoline that the convoy itself guzzled more than Army Group B received from Berlin over the same period. Every color-coded route shone with headlights stretching to the horizon. Drivers swapped out, trucks never rested, fuel sloshed endlessly toward the front. To a German logistician, it looked less like transport and more like a river of liquid power. Above them, the sky itself burned fuel faster than their armies could dream. P-47 Thunderbolts at 300 gallons an hour, medium bombers at 200. On December 23rd alone, Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties. A single day in the air consumed more fuel than Peiper possessed when the Battle of the Bulge began. By Peiper's own reckoning, the drive from warm engines starting in Germany to cold shells near La Gleize consumed 67,000 gallons. Captured stocks added roughly 55,000. He still ran a deficit just to keep moving. Tiger tanks swallowed 2.5 gallons per mile. Panthers 1.5. Half-tracks and trucks more as the terrain grew worse. Every skirmish meant an empty gauge and another dead machine. The American lines, by contrast, received 1.8 million gallons per day. Colonel James Snyder of 1st Army dryly noted in a log entry, "Fuel receipts yesterday exceeded consumption by 224,000 gallons. Reserves rising." The Americans were literally gaining fuel while fighting a major battle. Operation Pluto's undersea pipes pumped 1 million gallons a day across the channel. From Cherbourg, a network of landlines carried gas like blood through steel arteries. 800,000 gallons daily on the Cherbourg-Paris line, 650,000 on the Seine route. Even while advancing, the Allies filled reservoirs faster than they emptied them. Their risk wasn't starvation, it was overflow. By December 18th, the realization had spread through Peiper's command staff. They could advance or retreat, not both. Each kilometer forward was a bet they couldn't pay back. When radio intercepts revealed that American aircraft were bombing German convoys, his last hope of resupply vanished. The message came through static: fuel convoy destroyed. Continue with available resources. Available resources meant almost nothing. He called a conference inside a barn at Stumont. Officers stood in overcoats, breath steaming. Obersturmbannführer Verapertka traced a circle on a map. "We have gasoline for 20 kilometers," he reported. "The Meuse is 30. Nobody needed to state the conclusion. Hauptsturmführer Grüller recorded Peiper's response almost verbatim. "Gentlemen, we have learned we fight an enemy who can burn more fuel to deny it than we are given to conquer him. What we found at Hansfeld, which seemed miraculous, is nothing to them." That night, German tank crews siphoned every remaining drop into a handful of vehicles as artillery echoed in the distance. Others abandoned engines and joined infantry columns trudging through snow toward obscurity. Word of Peiper's predicament raced through German headquarters. General Otto von Manschufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, confessed later, "When I learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than let us capture it, I knew the offensive was finished before it began." Captured Staff Officer Friedrich von Donner told U.S. interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. Ours haven't seen any in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons, we count by the liter. How can we fight that?" By December 21st, the irony had reached cruel perfection. Peiper was surrounded at La Gleize by American units whose daily fuel issue, 340,000 gallons, dwarfed his entire remaining supply of barely 1,000. A U.S. private wrote home, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." That single quip summarized the abyss between the two sides. One army measured logistics in gallons, the other in millions. By December 23rd, clear skies allowed Allies to unleash their air fleets. 2,000 missions erased any last hope of German maneuver. Peiper's tanks crawled a few miles, sputtered, and halted forever. Crews drilled holes in fuel tanks to prevent capture. Officers fired pistols into engines. Out of 119 armored vehicles that entered the Ardennes, 39 still worked mechanically but none had gas. They were destroyed with remaining shells. 5,000 men had set out. Fewer than 800 would return. Back at headquarters, Germans finally computed the arithmetic of death. Offensive allocation, 5 million gallons. Fuel burned by Americans to prevent capture, 8 million. Fuel consumed by Allies that same week, over 50 million. Even Hitler's generals could read equations that simple. By December 23, the great gamble of the Reich was already collapsing under arithmetic. Germany's entire Ardennes fuel allocation, 5 million gallons, had bled away in 5 days. American forces were destroying more than that every 48 hours. The Wehrmacht hadn't lost by courage or tactics. It had simply run out of physics. General Courtney Hodges ordered that every Allied dump within 20 miles of German movement be burned. Explosions rolled through Belgian forests night after night. Gigantic firestorms of wasted wealth that Germany would have worshipped as treasure. While Peiper's men scraped frost from empty fuel drums, C-47 Skitrans flew 316 supply sorties into the Bastogne pocket, dropping 160,000 gallons of gasoline in a single day, an airborne waterfall of energy greater than the entire Peiper Kampfgruppe still possessed. In the same week, American planners approved requests for the following month, 245 million gallons for continued operations. The paperwork barely caused a stir. Even in movement, the contrast was humiliating. American tank brigades were designed for efficiency. Shermans consumed less than 1 gallon per mile, trucks averaged 8 miles per gallon loaded, and parts were interchangeable between thousands of vehicles. German forces dragged a circus of complexity, ostrich together T-34s, captured French Renaults, decrepit Czech PZ-38s, each demanding unique parts, unique oil weights, even unique wrench sizes. Every difference multiplied failure. Fuel wasn't Germany's only deficit. Its diversity of machinery burned what little logician clarity remained. Colonel Friedrich Zimmermann of Wehrmacht Logistics later wrote, "Our genius for design was our ruin. We could build anything but support nothing." Clear weather on December 23 proved as lethal as gunfire. Allied fighters and bombers poured through blue skies, engines inhaling aviation gas at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for whole campaigns. Each P-47 Thunderbolt burned 300 gallons an hour, each B-26 bomber 200. In 1 day of operations, Allied aircraft consumed more fuel than Germany had assigned to the entire Ardennes offensive. Below them, Peiper's armored spearhead froze in silence, its tanks lifeless statues of steel. That night, crews drilled holes into fuel tanks and set charges, turning the world's strongest armored vehicles into skeletal ruins. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had hurled east to west on December 16, only 39 remained operational but immobile. The rest became bonfires. Out of 5,000 men, roughly 770 would straggle back to friendly lines, half-frozen, all disillusioned. What destroyed them wasn't enemy shellfire. It was the cold, indifferent equation of petroleum. Within days, Peiper's experience became legend among German staff officers, a cautionary parable whispered in command posts lit by oil lamps. Field Marshal Model's chief of staff recorded the meeting on December 26. The Field Marshal read reports: 50,000 gallons captured, 2 million burned, another 8 million destroyed by Americans. He said quietly, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler refused to believe it, insisting photographs of flaming depots were Allied propaganda. Speer disagreed but knew argument was suicide. Far below that detached fury, soldiers understood perfectly. Grefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife, "The Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks where we march. It is hopeless." Behind the front lines, the industrial map of 1944 told everything. United States, 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. USSR, 110 million. Germany, including synthetics, and Romania, 33 million. Japan, 2.6 million. The entire Axis combined produced less than 2% of American output. No strategy could compensate for that scale. Field Marshal Keitel admitted it openly at Nuremberg. In 1940, we had operational superiority. By 1944, we could not move for want of fuel while the Americans moved whole armies like chess pieces. Industrial war had replaced heroism with mathematics. Peiper's tigers were masterpieces, 5-inch frontal armor, 88mm guns, combined harvester-sized gearboxes demanding miracles of engineering. None of it mattered if the needles on their gauges lay at zero. Dr. Richard Overy later summarized it succinctly. In 1944, the Allies' to-Axis production ratio was 5-1 in every major category, 50-1 in petroleum. No training, morale, or tactical brilliance could offset that tide. America built an aircraft every 5 minutes, a tank every 7, a ship daily. By year's end, U.S. refineries were running at 110% capacity, searching for uses for leftovers, synthetic rubber, plastics, high-octane additives, while Germany stripped dead planes for wiring. German prisoners captured in the Ardennes were more shaken by Allied extravagance than by any weapon. They saw GIs burning gasoline in stoves to heat coffee, washing uniforms in it, lighting cigarettes from barrels they drained rather than carry. Unteroffizier Reich Elm told interrogators, "We knew your numbers on paper, but when we saw men waste more than we possessed, the war ended for us inside." Letters smuggled home bore the same theme. Americans feed chocolate to dogs and throw bread to pigs. They truly live as gods. Propaganda about decadent democracy dissolved in each flicker of wasteful light. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans, but numerically it was the funeral of romantic warfare. Valor and discipline were crushed beneath logistics measured in hundreds of millions of gallons. When Peiper had captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, he thought he held a miracle. In truth, he held 0.6% of what the enemy delivered daily. The depot that seemed infinite was statistically irrelevant, smaller than the Red Ball Express's waste in 4 hours. Wars between industrial powers could now be predicted not by spirit, but by factory output and refinery capacity. As one American historian put it, the armored struggle in the Ardennes marked the moment when horsepower replaced heroism as the measure of victory. By Christmas Eve, Peiper's remaining troops slipped away on foot. Behind them lay a valley of gutted metal and empty drums, mute tombstones to a lost theory of warfare. For the Americans, those carcasses became evidence exhibits. For Germans, they became shrines of frustration. Major Robert Harrison of a U.S. recovery unit logged the final irony. 39 enemy tanks, intact, completely functional, abandoned for lack of 8,000 gallons of gasoline. The next morning, local reserves refueled Allied trucks with 10 times that amount just to deliver mail. What was ruin to one army was routine paperwork to the other. Years later, Peiper summarized it to historian Henry Lehman. Finding that depot was the worst thing. If we had run out earlier, we could have retreated with pride. Instead, we discovered that in front of us was infinity. They had oceans, we had drops. We discovered impossibility. The Tiger tank displayed at La Glise today sits frozen with its fuel needle at zero, an icon of unmatched engineering suffocated by empty tanks. Visitors still ask guides why so powerful a machine was left intact. The guide always answers the same 2 words: no fuel. After the Ardennes, the last illusions were destroyed in columns of production figures rather than fire. Across the Atlantic, America's assembly lines had become a second battlefield, one the Axis could never touch. In 1944, U.S. factories built 324,750 aircraft and 88,410 tanks, while Germany, trapped under bombing and fuel scarcity, produced barely a third of that number. Each machine arrived already fueled, crated, and shipped by an industrial army of welders and drivers. In oil, the numbers were annihilating. America refined 1.8 billion barrels. Germany managed 33 million. Japan's score, barely 2.6 million, was statistically invisible. The difference explained every success and every failure before a shot was fired. Field Marshal Guderian later summarized the truth that generals dared not tell Hitler. Tactics win battles, logistics win wars. And we had lost logistics. The Allied ability to waste became its own weapon. Colonels in charge of logistics now commanded destructive authority greater than field marshals of old. American quartermasters measured victory not only in miles but in how much they could afford to throw away. Major General Lunsford Oliver once joked, "We burn more gasoline making mistakes than Jerry gets in a year." It was no exaggeration. By the end of 1944, The Red Ball Express alone consumed 300,000 gallons a day, more than all Axis armored divisions combined received. German officers captured later spoke of this waste with awe close to reverence. Oberst Heinz Gallnitz described standing beside a burned American Jeep at La Gleise. They left it for a broken axle with half a tank of petrol. In Germany, we would have drained it, repaired it, sent it back. Here they shrugged and moved on. The realization hit harder than artillery barrages ever had. In total war, indifference signified supremacy. By February 1945, German fuel production ceased entirely. Synthetic plants lay flattened, railways shattered, oil depots blasted flat by Allied air raids. The Luftwaffe was a ground museum. Its pilots walked to surrender. Etzel Muller, once an instructor in the Air Ministry, wrote bitterly, "Our aces stood ready, their aircraft gleaming, and not one could start an engine. Million-mark planes idle for want of few leaders. Entire panzer divisions waited in forests not for orders, but for deliveries that would never come." General Fritz Bohlen recalled, "We had 42 operational tanks, ammunition in plenty, crews trained. We had 300 liters of fuel, enough to reach the next village. At dawn, they demolished their own machines and marched into captivity." Across the Rhine, Patton's Third Army idled in traffic jams, tanks nose to tail, because there were too many vehicles on the roads. It was a scale of excess inconceivable to the men on the other side. For the average German, the revelation came not from statistics but from sight. Prisoners of war arriving in American camps remembered first the smell, diesel, oil, gasoline everywhere, and then the movement. Trucks, jeeps, tractors, planes. Nothing stood still. Unteroffizier Ernst Krauss wrote home from capture, "The camp kitchen uses more power than our entire village. Every light burns all night. They live in daylight while we live in ashes." Even Propaganda Minister Goebbels noted despair in his December 1944 diary entry. Reports of soldiers speaking openly of American material strength. Morale affected more by stories of abundance than by defeats in battle. The myth of racial superiority dissolved in clouds of exhaust fumes. Historians later tried to translate this psychological implosion into simple math. Dr. Trevor Dupuy calculated that in December 1944, every American soldier at the front was supported by 67 pounds of supplies daily. Each German received 3. That difference, multiplied over millions of men, was more decisive than any general's plan. By December's end, the German offensive had burned roughly 2.8 million gallons, almost 40% of its total allocation, most of it hauled from captured dumps. During the same period, U.S. forces in Europe consumed 267 million gallons, 95 times the fuel, and they still called it a supply challenge. Fuel had become the pulse of civilization itself, and America's heartbeat was deafening. Before the 20th century, strategy was art. Surprise, maneuver, courage. The Ardennes ended that era. No amount of daring could overcome sustained mass production. Tanks stalled before equations. Fighter pilots surrendered to refinery output. One German colonel called it the end of knights and the beginning of accountants. He wasn't wrong. The notebook replaced the sword as the symbol of command. The whispered phrase among Allied staff was brutal but accurate. Quantity is quality. The Nazis had preached that sheer will could conquer deficiencies. At Hansfeld, that illusion evaporated. When soldiers saw Americans destroy millions of gallons without hesitation, they recognized that ideology couldn't substitute for infrastructure. Grippler Peiper's discovery became shorthand in post-war memoirs for the point of no return, the exact moment idealism died. To his veterans, the cracking of those fuel drums was louder than any bomb. It was the noise of reality intruding. "We fought courage with calculation," one survivor wrote. Calculation won. By April 1945, remnants of Peiper's corps surrendered willingly rather than waste lives in immobilized machines. Many later testified that their defeat had been sealed not by firepower but by realization. Captured Lieutenant Hans Wagner told interrogators, "You could replace losses faster than we could count ours. If every tank we built required angels to push, still we would lose when the fuel ran out." The once boastful image of the invincible German panzer arm ended not in flames, but in muteness beside empty gas gauges. At La Gleize the Tiger tank still sits, paint faded, armor intact, fuel gauge permanently frozen at zero. Visitors stare at its hulking form, the perfect predator turned fossil. Beneath museum lighting, its engine remains clean enough to run if you poured in gasoline. But that's the eternal caveat. If there were gasoline. Plaques describe the technical marvels, the Maybach engine, the 88 gun. But the last line always draws the crowd's attention. Abandoned for lack of fuel. That label has become epitaph and warning. Joachim Peiper survived the war, imprisoned for war crimes until 1956. In interviews before his death, he spoke little of tactics and much of numbers. To historian Henry Lehman in 1967, he said, "At Hansfeld, we thought we had found a miracle. I realized later it was a lesson. We fought a nation that measured resources by oceans, while we counted drops." Once you understand that, the war ends for you inside, long before the capitulation. Whatever one thinks of Peiper's morality, his insight stands as the purest autopsy of modern warfare. The bigger engine wins. Germany entered the Second World War believing discipline and daring could overcome any material disadvantage. The Ardennes proved otherwise. Every empty tank and every burned depot wrote the same verdict in black smoke across the Belgian sky. The mechanics had replaced the mythmakers. By 1945, the world understood war on new terms: spreadsheet courage, refinery bravery. Humanity had entered the age of logistics. When Peiper's engines died on the frozen Belgian road, it was not merely mechanical failure. It was civilization drawing a ledger line and closing the account of the Third Reich. The Americans advanced because they could. The Germans retreated because they must. Industrial competence had conquered ideology. The jerrycan at Hansfeld became the measuring cup of fate, holding less than 0.5% of the enemy's daily consumption. History still reverberates with that lesson. Courage inspires, but fuel decides.